welcome to Cycle Sports Radio. I am your host, Patrick Harris, and I'm also the executive producer of Cycle Sports TV. You can find us at cyclesportstv.com. You can also find us on YouTube at Cycle Sports TV, as well as on Facebook and Twitter. And, of course, today we are going to be talking about a very cool new craze, and let's hope it sticks around for a long time, and that is vintage bikes. And today we have some amazing people in studio and on the phone with us. First, we have Matt Wiley from Racetech. He's calling in from Arizona. And Steve McAnulty, who is the owner of Las Vegas Dyno Tech and the producer of Vintage Bike Nights here in Las Vegas. Two absolutely amazingly talented gentlemen. And first, what we're going to do is we're going to go over to Matt. Matt is on the phone with us. And Matt, tell us a little bit about who Matt Wiley is.
For the most part, like a lot of riders, I got interested in bikes in junior high and high school, and got my first bike and started riding, and learned to do my own work because young man, didn't have a lot of spare money. I'm mechanically inclined, and was interested in doing it. And ran into a situation I wasn't real comfortable in trying to attempt myself, and ended up taking the motorcycle to a dealership to have it fixed, which was an unmitigated disaster, and kind of came to the conclusion, I can do better than this, So kind of changed my track on what I wanted to do for a living, and went to American Motorcycle Institute in the 80s and graduated, and been working in the industry ever since, kind of all levels. I've worked at independent shops, dealerships, then the manufacturer's rep, now working for Racetech, developing their vintage and touring motorcycle suspension programs.
And you do a lot with ARMA as well, too, with the vintage racing and developing suspension for these older bikes for competition as well, don't you?
Yeah, I do. The old saying for NASCAR goes, what wins on Sunday sells on Monday. And the vintage story with Racetech is, kind of entertaining. I started working with vintage riders back in the early 90s when it was really just becoming of interest, so to speak. A couple of my regular customers, they were former, WERA, AMA racers and whatnot, started carrying in, pieces of these bikes. And, one guy was building an MTR 125 Honda. The other one was building a CB400F, a 404 for road racing. And we were just doing all kinds of trick things to these. And I had read a little bit about vintage racing in some of the mainstream magazines, but didn't realize how much it was developing. And kind of caught my interest. So anyway, one of the reasons Racetech hired me was to develop product lines that they didn't have, develop new markets for them. And, my background is a little bit more street-oriented than dirt, so I started working with this. And I remember telling them, hey, yeah, we're going to, do some stuff with the vintage bikes. And, of course, the younger set at Racetech kind of, chuckled at me and, oh, that's just silly. That's a waste of time. But, Paul Feed, the owner, he believed in it. A couple of his friends that had motocrossed with him in the 70s and 80s were already into the vintage thing. He said, oh, by all means, go for it. So, went out to the track, and it was a great opportunity for R&D, because how do you start? Well, you got to get specifications, got to get some components in my hand to measure them and figure out what's going to fit what, because, when I was working on that stuff back in the 80s, I didn't know I was going to be developing, suspension components for it, in the 2000s. So anyway, they were real cooperative, real interested. A lot of the folks had already figured out how to fit Racetech components to their bikes, and so we got a whole lot of bikes set up, and then I started going to the track and being there as much as possible, technical support, helping them adjust it and dial it in and figure out what worked, and it was great for everybody. We took lots of time off the lap times, and I was able to develop what settings worked better than others and what applications worked and so forth. And one of my biggest satisfactions this past year at the Barber Vintage Festival, I did a whole fleet of Aramaki 350 Sprints for a couple different teams. And the team owners, managers came over to me on Saturday, after the first race and said, man, the only thing different on this bike from last year is your suspension work. And one bike was 6 seconds a lap faster, one bike was 4 seconds a lap faster, and the other bike was 3 seconds a lap faster. So, not too bad for just having a forks redone with some products,
And that's one of the things that we're definitely going to get into today is that, boy, you can really improve these things because the suspension technology back then was, way behind everything else. They could make the bikes go fast. They just couldn't make them turn really well. Now, Steve, you have a shop here in Las Vegas, but you have a pretty interesting past. You started in automotive, didn't you?
Yes, I was certified automotive tech by the time I was 18. 18, all the way through school, professional mechanic at that point. Got really bored of that and decided to follow my passion, which was motorcycles. Started riding motorcycles when I was a kid, 10, 11, 12 years old maybe, somewhere around there. And I always wrenched on my bikes all myself and never had the experience like Matt had of having to take my bikes to a dealership. So
17, give me a break.
So the basically spent years and years and years just learning how to work on that stuff just by taking it apart, putting it together, and perfecting them skills at that point.
Yeah, now you work on, and that's one thing. If you ever get a chance to visit Steve over at his shop, it's unlike most shops that you'll see. Most shops that you go into will either have all sports bikes or all Harleys or all something. Mm-hmm. There is every type of bike you can imagine at your shop at any given time.
Well, I tried to bridge that gap between like American V-twins and sport bikes and dirt bikes and everything like that into one shop.
Yeah.
And a lot of people in my life says this can't be done as an independent shop. You have to specialize. So I use my tuning as my specialized part of it, but I work on anything. I really don't care what it is. It's all the same bike to me at that point.
Yeah, because I mean there's everything from custom choppers to sport bikes to vintage bikes to dirt bikes to quads to anything that's classified a motorcycle winds up in your shop.
Pretty much.
I got to say I've been to Steve's shop a couple different times and I really appreciate it because it's got kind of an old school feel to it. It feels like a motorcycle shop and not one of these sanitized boutique things that's the industry standard today. And he's always got all kinds of cool stuff in there. I mean, I look around and go, oh, yeah, hey, Steve, can I come up on the weekends and play,
Yeah. Oh, trust me, every time I go in there, it's like, oh, look, check that out. Oh, that's cool. Where did you get this?
I don't even know where I find this stuff. Really, guys just pull this stuff out of their garage that's been sitting there for 20 years.
Yeah.
And here, Steve, fix this.
But nobody else works on them. I mean, you say vintage to anybody, and they get scared. You say carburetors to most shops in town. They go, oh,
we can't go see Steve.
Yeah, or they'll say, we got one guy that works on those. He's 6 months backlogged, and it's going to be $50 extra per hour for him to work on your carbureted bike. It's like, but it needs work now. Yeah, but don't worry, we'll get it by the end of the year.
End of next year.
Yeah. So, and the big thing now is obviously, and that's why I wanted to do this show is, and I don't know why it took so long, because let's face it, when I was a kid, classic cars were a big deal.
Me too.
Muscle cars were the thing. I mean, cars that were built when I was born were the hot thing when I was a teenager. Mm-hmm. Vintage bikes seem to just now be coming into their own as far as popularity and becoming the cool, hip thing to have. Matt, why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. It is really, to a certain degree, replaced the custom V-twin thing, which, certainly is still active. But, let's face it, mid-'90s until the, 04 or 05 or so maybe, the custom V-twin thing was just all the rage. And people started to migrate more to these vintage bikes, and I think it's a nostalgia thing. Retro is in.
Yeah.
Just look at a brand new car, off the lot. And the interior design and the lines. Ford's mimicking the Mustangs of the 60s and, Chevy, the Camaros of the late 60s and early 70s and so forth. And the motorcycle manufacturers have had retro models too. The irony is, they made some really neat retro models, the Honda GB500, the Kawasaki W650, that never sold. And now the things are worth like twice as much as they were to begin with, when they were sold new. So I think that people are kind of, I don't know, look at it like this. What was the bike that you lusted for, when you were in high school or college?
Yeah.
But it was beyond your reach for one reason or another. And now all of a sudden you can get a hold of that bike and make it into what you always dreamed of having. And going back to your, carburetor discussion of a minute ago, the vintage bikes are simple enough to a large degree that, most folks with mechanical aptitude can actually do a large part of the work themselves. Or the modern bikes, a lot like cars, they're computerized and everything's packed in so densely. There's just a real pain in the tail to work on. Where the vintage bikes are much more simple. There's room to get your hands on it. It's a simpler design, and so folks are having fun with it. And I know that's a part of it for me. I've been a motorcycle technician for 27 years. When I got into the business, I didn't care about anything old. I've been riding that. It's like, give me the newest, latest, greatest thing.
Yeah.
And now it's not that I don't work on modern bikes, but I'd rather not. It's just they're just a pain. I got a little joke that I say. Real race bikes have 2 strokes and 2 shocks. It was made after '89. It was a crime. So,
Oh yeah.
But no, retro's just an in thing. And one of the interesting things I find about it is it's not just the older set. The folks that were riding these bikes in their youth. It's a lot of younger guys too, which is interesting. Because these bikes were made before they were born. But yet they have an interest in them. And I find that interesting.
We're starting to see clubs form of guys that are in their 20s and early 30s that are riding bikes, like you said, that are older than they are, but that's all they ride. Now, Steve, on a shop perspective, how much more percentage-wise are you seeing vintage bikes coming in your shop now than maybe 5 years ago?
Oh, it's huge difference. The death of the chopper, I call it.
Yeah,
was about 2005, right in that range right there. Once that bike went away, I see all kinds of cafe bikes come out, all kinds of bobbers come out, like Japanese bobbers and old CBs. Old CBs are getting real tough to get your hands on nowadays. Everybody wants a CB 750 for some reason. I love that bike. It's heavy. It works good, but and you can make just about whatever you want out of that bike. Parts are available everywhere for that thing too, but. Some of the more rare models, I see some of these kids just picking up because they see them on Craigslist or eBay or something like that, and I see them pick these bikes up for dirt cheap. And the problem is the amount of work that they need is just insane. I mean, it costs too much money to really put that together for your average rider for his first bike. Yeah,
because if you're not mechanically inclined, let's face it, that's one of the things we're going to talk about is how to find a good vintage bike. There's a lot of great barn finds out there, and I say great meaning great if you have mechanical skills.
Or you're a collector.
But you're going to have to put some work into it. Somebody that wants to buy and have fun with one of these bikes and not put a lot into it, how do they do that?
That's a tough game right there. Really, you got to find one low mileage that's been stored correctly over the years.
Yeah.
It's been rebuilt once or twice in its life already, usually, by that point. If you can find documentation on them bikes over the years, it's a lot easier to track of what's done to it and what potentially could happen to it.
So, Matt, you just picked up a KZ here recently for pretty cheap.
$99.
That is okay. Not pretty cheap. That was a steal.
I got 200.
It was, it's by no means one of the more desirable KZs. It's a KZ 1000 ST, which is the shaft drive model.
Yeah.
Which kind of goes towards my orientation. I prefer motorcycles with a shaft drive. I just don't like having to deal with chains. I prefer a shaft. But I've always liked the angular styling of that model. It was always one I kind of wanted over the years, and it was just a fluke kind of a thing. I was actually not looking. I was in the classifieds looking for something else entirely, and came across this really odd ad. A guy had a whole series of vintage bikes listed, a couple of Brit bikes, about a half dozen Japanese models, year and model of bike, no description of condition, mileage, or price, and a phone number. And one of the other bikes listed was a Yamaha TY250, which is a real desirable Yamaha trials bike, and they're real hard to find. And so I happened to be in the midst of emailing with a good friend of mine, Jim Sweezy, who helps me out at track for ARMA events and touring rallies and so forth. And he says, hey, if one of your ARMA guys ever's got a TY he wants to cut loose from, for reasonable bucks, let me know. So I emailed him this ad, and I said, well, maybe you're giving me the excuse I needed. Do you want to get a look at this? He said, yeah. So I get to this guy's place, and, I live up in the White Mountains, Arizona, so it's a rural area. It's, we're up out in the sticks, and this guy was like 30 miles out in the middle of nowhere, and I roll up, and, there's all these bikes lined up, and I see the KZ in the background, but the TY was out front, and that thing looked good. I mean, it wasn't beat up. It was all there. Guys telling me about it. It's got brand new tires on it. And I'm stroking the kicker. And he says, "Oh yeah, we just put a top end on it. And the pipe and the carb are in a box, and some of the other pieces are laying there." And I take a picture of it, and I'm sending it to my friend Jim. And I said, "Well, how much do you want for this?" He says, $99. I was like, "Oh my God!" And I said, "Jim, $99 bucks." And I load it up, and he was like, "Yeah." So we walk back to the KZ, and I'm looking at it. That thing looks amazingly good, and he's telling me the tale behind it and so forth. And I'm thinking, he's going to want a pretty good buck for this. I said, what do you want for this? And he said, $99.
Wow.
Well, okay. Of course, I had so little confidence that this would amount to anything. I had my truck. I didn't have any tie downs. I didn't have a ramp. I didn't bring any cash with me. So I'm going to drive 30 miles back into town, get my tie downs, get my ramp, stop at the bank, get some cash, get back and load these things up. But, I took some pictures of it, and I posted it on my Facebook page, and I had about half a dozen people offering me, $300, $400, $500. Yeah, it's this. I'll take it right now.
Yeah, exactly.
No.
Yeah. Exactly.
Oh, hang on.
Now, what kind of work? Because you got it cheap, and now if you get a vintage bike cheap, what are you going to have to do these things to get them back on the road typically? What are some of the things you're going to be looking at?
Well, it's going to be obligatory that you're going to have to do carburetor overhaul and service on the things, unless it was running. I mean, if it's been sitting for more than 6 months, you're going to have some sort of carburetor issues. And if it's been sitting for years, you're going to have some major carburetor issues. One of the biggest problems we have at all levels of motorcycling today, it's not just the vintage market, is what they've done with the gasoline these days.
Oh, yeah.
It's tragic, and it has all kinds of issues. So, to get the thing up and running, certainly you're going to have to, overhaul the carburetors and, change all your filters and fluids. Most likely, get some fresh rubber on it. The tires are going to be, even if they got tread on them, they're going to be too old to ride on safely.
Yeah.
And then if it's been sitting a long time, the brakes might be stuck and some things like that. It varies a lot. Kind of going to your remark on, how do you find a vintage bike that you don't have to put a bunch of money into, it's more expensive up front, but a lot of times it's cheaper in the end if you're patient.
Yeah.
Find a collector that's parting with a portion of his collection to make room for something new, or somebody that that did a build or restoration and is tired of it, or it wasn't what they wanted it to be, or whatever. And you're buying this bike for it might be $2,000-$3,000, but these people have already spent $5,000 to $10,000 getting it where it is.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
If you can find something like that, a lot of times you're money ahead buying something that somebody else has already done the heavy lifting on for you.
Now, the big thing too is if you're not super mechanically inclined, you have to find a shop that is. Now, obviously, we're lucky here because we have Steve, so that's why Steve's sitting in the room with us right now, because you could take anything to him and he could fix it. But that's not always the case. How do you find? And I'm going to ask Matt this first, and then I'll have you talk about it. How do you find a shop that's going to be able to work on these and know what the hell they're doing? What do you do?
Well, it's both rare and not. Like Steve, I have encountered quite a few of my race tech dealers, that do a lot with vintage bikes, and of course, to a large degree, that's because they're vintage racers.
Yeah.
Whether it's off-road or road race, that is a big portion of their livelihood and fun is going out and playing with these things. So naturally, they're inclined to work on it. So there's certainly places everywhere, but finding them in your particular area can be the big trick. There's several vintage-oriented magazines on the market today, and most of them do some sort of highlight on shops that specialize in this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that can certainly be a good resource, to look through those magazines and see if they've highlighted a shop that's in your area, or at least close enough to deal with. If nothing else, there's plenty of people that advertise in these magazines that they'll do work for you. So you're mechanically inclined enough maybe to take components on and off the bike. Maybe not overhaul them specifically, maybe not overhaul the motor or rebuild the suspension or the brakes or the carburetors, but you can get the components on and off the bike. Well, then you can find one of these specialty folks, and you can send it off to them, and they'll do the heavy lifting there for your engine rebuild or your cylinder head refurbishment, and brakes, carburetor, suspension, or whatever it is, and send it back to you. So at that point, you don't need the specialty tools and specialty knowledge, just the basic stuff to get components on and off the bike. And it's something I do on the side from Race Tech is I do quite a bit of vintage carburetor overhauls and brake rebuilds and so forth, because folks are looking for it. If there's nobody in your area, what are you going to do? And that is one possible solution.
Yeah, and I know with Steve's shop, when you walk into a shop, it's obvious. You see the bike sitting there. I mean, Steve, do you think that's kind of important if somebody lives in a big town to maybe go check out the shop first or try to find somebody?
Sure. It's definitely worth checking out the shop before you go in there, because you never know what you're going to get into. But another avenue, the way that I would go at it, if I didn't own a shop, I didn't know anybody had a shop or something like that, I would look at like some social media outlets and check around some forum sites and or Facebook or whatever, and ask friends or friends of friends out there if they can help you out with that, point you in the right direction on where to go.
So getting some referrals from, because there's a lot of clubs, like I said, there's a lot of clubs out there, and these guys have to get their bikes worked on.
For sure.
And
for sure. And I do a lot with clubs here in Vegas. And even outside of Vegas, I do a lot of stuff for, guys from Arizona, guys from California, guys from Utah that will trailer their stuff down to my shop just to get it fixed.
Yeah, I know Lee Parks does that all the time.
But and especially on some of the vintage stuff. I had a couple guys in today with old XS 650s, and they're trying to turn them into Triumph choppers almost. Yeah. And so I was kind of giving these guys a avenue to go. Which way are you going to go with this bike? What kind of suspension are we going to put on it, and what do you want the bike to look at? And maybe we can help you out with like finding parts or finding custom fabricators to make stuff for that. Yeah. So I do a whole bunch of that too. I'll turn some of my customers on to other people or other vendors that I use sometimes.
Okay. So now when you get into, we've been talking a lot about cost for this stuff. If I'm looking into a vintage bike, but I want something inexpensive, but I want it, instead of going out and buying an EX500 because I just want a commuter bike or something like that, I want something vintage. Where do I need to start looking? Because obviously some vintage bike, they're not all made equal. Some are going to be a lot more expensive than others.
Yes. And price normally deems the condition of that bike. Yeah. If you could find an old XS 650 that's super expensive right there, I bet you that bike is probably in really good shape. Yeah. If they're asking, you go out there and the bike's $100.
Yeah, probably some issues.
You don't know what you're getting into at this point. Now we got to do a lot of static tests on the bike before we even take it apart. You got compression tests that you're going to do, and you're going to check brakes and clutches and suspensions and all kinds of good stuff.
Was now the size of the bike, like going maybe for a single or dual cylinder as opposed to a 4-cylinder, is that going to make a difference?
Price wise, yes. Yeah. Price wise, yes. I mean, think about it. If you got a 4-cylinder engine, you got 4 pistons to buy. Yeah. You got a 1-cylinder engine, you're only buying one.
So if I go off and find an SR500, that's going to be a lot easier to maintain than maybe a 404, a Honda 404.
True. Potentially.
All things being equal.
Yes.
Because obviously for something like this is once you have the bike working, once the bike is, let's just say the brakes work, the carburetors have been cleaned and synced, and everything is working. Cost of ownership on a vintage bike. Matt, I'll have you start with this. If you have a vintage bike that's working the way it should be, is it going to be equal to or more expensive to own and maintain than a modern bike?
Well, I would say that depends. I would say it could go either way. To some extent, it is going to depend on the type of bike that you're dealing with and the level of rebuild, restoration, whatever you want to say that was done on it. If you've got, a Kawasaki triple two-stroke, you've got a higher potential for disaster, just like Steve said, multiple pistons.
Steve has 3 of those in his shop, by the way.
I love those bikes. I had a Cali triple when I was in high school, and it was just awesome fun, and it was a hand grenade,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And they're getting hard to find parts for, so the parts tend to be more expensive for them. So, let's take, apples and apples, so to speak. It's like, all right, you get a Kawasaki H2 750 triple, versus, a Kawasaki 750 twin four-stroke. The 750 twin four-stroke is going to be cheaper and easier to maintain, So I would say it comes down to a couple things. It potentially can be cheaper, provided that you can do at least the basics yourself. Yeah. If you're a person that, all you can do is put the key in it and ride it and air up your tires and charge up your battery, may not be the best thing for you. Yeah. Because these older bikes, they weren't as sophisticated. They required, a shorter maintenance schedule and, a little bit more tinkering to keep them working and so forth. On the other hand, you can buy 4 tires and inner tubes for your vintage bike for about the price of one sport radial for a CSXR.
And they'll last a lot longer, too.
Yes.
Well, yeah, so I would say that really depends. Something that's very reliable and bulletproof, so to speak, like Steve mentioned a Honda CB750, 550, 750 Honda 4s, Yamaha XS 650s, SR 500s. This is pretty tough. They might need just a little bit of tinkering, but they hold up real well. And then you got more finicky stuff like the high-performance Japanese two-strokes of the 70s, and then, of course, any kind of Brit bike or classic Harley, you're constantly filling with one of those. Yeah. So if you're not in a position to do at least a significant portion of the maintenance yourself, it could get ugly for you.
Well, and what do you need to know? So if I want to own a vintage bike and I know that I'm going to have to do some work, what work should I be capable of doing to be comfortable with driving this on a daily basis? What do you think, Steve? If you're as a shop owner,
I would say you at least know how to tinker with your carburetors, do your basic adjustments, your idle speed adjustments, and your air mix adjustments. Be able to do that. Be able to do brake adjustments. A lot of them old bikes will have mechanical brakes on them, to where you got to do a lot of adjusting to them. Even though they're hydraulic, you still got a lot of adjustments that you need to do in there. Not like a modern disc brake with self-adjusting.
Because you could have drum brakes that you have to know how to adjust.
True. So you got to be able to tinker with your bike. Basically, you got to have some level of mechanical ability.
Yeah. Because Matt, you put a lot of miles on vintage bikes. In fact, you have a couple of Yamahas that you have tens of thousands of miles that you've put on them, just from basically going back and forth to race tech events. When you're putting all these miles on these vintage bikes, what are you having to do on the road to keep these things going?
Well, fortunately, because of the models I happen to be partial to, not that much. I'm kind of into the Yamaha Seika series from the 80s. Mm-hmm. I've had pretty much every model there is. It's shaft drive, air-cooled, electronic ignition, constant velocity carbureted four-cylinder. And, the early to mid-'80s is really the time period when bikes got very reliable, when they really hit the reliability level fairly consistent with cars. So. Sure. Unless something physically broke, your primary maintenance was, filters and fluids for the most part, and the occasional valve and carb adjustment. So really the only troubles I've had with my Seikas doing multiple cross-country, top and coast to coast, runs, is fuel system issues. I've gotten bad gas a few times. It's been real aggravating, and, maybe I've had to drain and flush the carbs, by the side of the road to get some crap out of it or drain a tank. And I've had a couple of, ignition module failures on my turbo because that was just prone to that model. And it was fairly sophisticated for its time, and the electronics, while still decent, were relatively crude. And, hey, let's face it, things 25, 30 years old.
Yeah, true.
I'd say that it takes a special kind of idiot, to be alone on a 25-year-old motorcycle on a two-lane road with nothing in sight, no cell phone service. So, I kind of get a kick out of that.
So now let's say, let's face it, we've been doing it to hot rods for years. We take these hot rods and we modernize them. We go in and we get that Mustang, that Camaro, and we put the big disc brakes on, and we put the fuel-injected motor, upgrade the suspension and all the steering components. That you can do that now with a lot of vintage bikes. So if you're looking, if say for instance I want to do a custom vintage, but I want it reliable, I want to be able to ride hard, I want to be able to do more with it than the bike was designed to do. What's my path? Where do I need to start? Matt, we'll start with you.
Well, certainly the weak links on the vintage bikes were the brakes and the suspension. Yeah. Just about all of them went faster than they should for their ability to stop and turn.
Kawasaki H2s.
Really, let's face it, any of the vintage bikes. And if you look back, the ones that really handled well were the small bore bikes. The Ducati 350s and the Honda 404s and the Yamaha RDs. And the part of the reason they handled good because they were lightweight. They didn't have a lot of weight, flexing on the frames and the forks and the wheels and everything else. But there's a couple avenues you can go. The guys that are building, well, let's look at it like this. There's kind of, three levels, and I'll be interested to see if Steve agrees with me on this, but I have seen kind of three levels on the vintage bikes.
Okay.
One is the, concourse restoration, so to speak.
Yeah.
Or in other words, we're trying to return a bike to its original stock condition to make it just like it was when it's new with no significant modifications.
So it looks beautiful, but it has all the same issues that it had when it was brand new.
Yes. Well, yeah, it's museum grade, living room grade, whatever you want to call it, restoration. Make it exactly like it was, when it was produced, and then you've got your, the typical term is cafe racer, where the guys are taking typical popular models, XS 650s, CB 450s, and 750s, Brit bikes and stuff like that, and they are cutting them up to a large degree with custom seats and body work and oftentimes putting modern suspension on it, which has got its pros and cons. Certainly it's nice to have a trick adjustable inverted fork on your 1970s era bike. I mean, that's pretty cool, but it creates some issues because the fork, as sophisticated as it is, probably isn't really going to work right on that bike. On everything from the aspects of chassis geometry, to the actual settings on suspension. So it looks bitchin', but it doesn't work as good as it could or should. And an awful lot of guys convert these cafe racers to a single shock rear suspension. Of course, pretty much everything until the mid '80s was twin shock.
Sure.
And these guys want to convert these things up. They custom fab up a swing arm and cut up the frame and weld a bunch of brackets on it and put a single shock on it. And worked with a lot of these guys and have seen a lot of these bikes, and rarely does that work very well.
It looks cool.
Really cool. And it's funny, you see in some of these magazines where guys have done up bikes that way, and man, it looked just awesome. I was like, oh, cool, and you'll notice that they don't really give any report on how the bike works going down the road.
It's never been down the road yet.
Yeah, exactly. They just take pictures of it and put it back in the garage.
Yeah, or they rode it and they got up to 105 mile an hour and it dang near threw them off, and now they don't want to ride it anymore.
Yeah,
and then of course the third aspect is your vintage racer, where hey, let's we're setting up, take thing on the track. Don't really have any intentions or aspirations to ever go on the street. We're just going to be on the track with it, which gives you more flexibility. The only real limitations are the rules of the class you're going to race it in. And then there's something in the middle, which is what I run, and that's your functional restoration, where take a bike from the 70s or 80s, and I'm going to use largely the existing componentry, but I'm going to modernize it. I'm going to upgrade the suspension components. I'm going to upgrade the brakes with modern grade brake pads and steel braided lines, and maybe a little better caliper, master cylinder, or something like that. But largely leave the bike in its stock form, so to speak. I am just going to improve what's there at whatever level is available to me to make the thing, functional, safe, enjoyable, and reliable.
Yeah. Now, I know with Steve, not only do you fix things, but you also do a lot of customizing, and you do all of it. You do the restoration stuff, but you also have some custom stuff. In fact, you were riding one today.
I blew one up all the way
till the head gasket blew. So, what are some of the issues that you have applying modern suspension components to some of these vintage bikes?
Exactly what Matt said. They look bitchin'. They look good. You can't look any better than that. Put it on the road though, and try to get that geometry set right, because the fork length is never right. You're either raising the bike or lowering the bike.
Sure.
And then you're mix matching a whole bunch of stuff on there just to fabricate to make it look good.
Yeah.
Now on my personal bike, I went through and I had all the race tech stuff done, and I did all that stuff and all the
measurements.
All my measurements and geometry were set up right. So I got my bike dialed in pretty well. But it took a while and a lot of R&D for me to get that bike to work correctly.
Because just because you get it to fit doesn't mean it works.
True.
So
when I first put that on there, I'm on my third front end on that bike that I have now.
Yeah.
I keep switching them out. If it doesn't work, I'll switch it out, get one that's a couple inches longer, or something like that, get the geometry set up correctly, and then get all the valving, the spring rates, and everything like that set up too. That was a difficult process. It took a long time to actually get it to handle right.
Yeah.
But said and done, a couple years later, after just toying with it on my free time, just toy around with that bike, I got it pretty dialed in. The bike does what it's told now.
Because I think the big issue, and I think this is also was with the choppers. The choppers were all form, no function. True. I mean, the reality is those $100,000 choppers, you couldn't do anything with them but go down the road at 35.
I still work on them, and they're still miserable to ride for.
Yeah. And they look beautiful, and they're great. They're a nice piece of art, but as functional, they don't really work. And unfortunately, I think sometimes now you get some of these custom builders with some of the cafe stuff, and let's make it look cool, but they forget to make it function. Yeah. So, Matt, being that you have dealt with suspension for so long and are part of development, if somebody's building a custom bike, okay, and we've talked a little bit about this, what are some of the concerns, some of the things that they don't want to change that will screw up the handling of the bike?
Well, in most cases, unless you're going for a look, if you want function and comfort and everything else, for most models, you're better off to upgrade your existing forks.
Yeah.
With aftermarket internal improvements, race tech stuff and so forth, and some good aftermarket shocks, and stay with the twin shock setup rather than blowing your bank trying to convert it to a single shock that you'll take years to make work right, or maybe never even will. folks are always surprised at just how good you can make these old bikes work. I mean, I talked about a 1972 Aramaki 350 that we took 6 seconds off the lap time going around Barber racetrack, with a Racetech fork upgrade. Okay, well, you say, well, but yeah, Matt, that's a race bike. It's okay. Well, let's put that on the street. I ride 1983 Yamaha Seika coast to coast in comfort. At Mid-Ohio Vintage Days a few years ago, Mike Smith, who was a factory rider for Honda and Harley and a development rider, for those guys back in the 80s and early 90s, was there with us. And if you've ever been to Mid-Ohio, it's out in the middle of the cornfields. It's pretty good distancing. Our hotel was 40 miles away, down a bunch of bumpy back roads, and Mike started stressing. About noon, he'd realized he forgot to take his blood pressure meds. And the only other vehicle there besides my Seika Turbo was the service truck, which really wasn't the best thing to leave for an hour and a half. So it's Mike, take the Yamaha, go back to the hotel, get your meds, take your time, take a little ride, enjoy yourself. So I've never really been inclined to let other people ride my motorcycles, because they tend to get crashed when you let other people ride them. But, this guy will be all right. I wasn't too worried about it, So he comes back quite some time later, and he said, well, I got lost, but I took a nice ride and whatnot. And I said, well, what do you think of the bike? I mean, primarily the suspension, because it's nice to get feedback, from somebody else.
Sure.
Kind of cocked his head and said, the suspension on that's better than my factory Honda road race bike was back in '88, '89. Okay, right. So if you feel the need to change components, I mean, let's face it, the weak link in the forks on most of these vintage bikes is the size.
Yeah.
They're small.
Yeah.
They're 34, 35, 36 millimeter, which is pretty skinny. Kind of prone to flex and whatnot if you're pushing on the bike. So rather than, try to put, the obligatory R6 front end, which is what everybody seems to want to use, it works miserably, because like Steve said, the forks are way too short, and you got triple clamp issues and all kinds of nightmare to fit it. Figure out how long your forks are, and go find a later model bike with what we call conventional forks, with the sliders are at the bottom, non-upside down ones, chrome tubes at the top.
Like my ZRX.
Bigger, that 39, 41, 43 millimeter or something like that. It's going to be a lot easier to graft onto the bike, and it's going to be cheaper and easier to upgrade than the inverted front end off of a sport bike.
Sure.
Now, like I say, you don't have to do that thing, kind of thing. That's going to be largely if you're really pushing the performance envelope for a bike of that type, or you're going racing, or you just really want the the big muscular look of a bigger front end. But for the average guy, take what you got. Put Racetech springs, gold valves in there, and put some good shocks on the back, and you'll be fine. And I got to tell you, Steve mentioned earlier, you get what you pay for. When he's talking about the $100 bike, versus the $3,000 bike, that's largely been done. And the same is really true, particularly with shock absorbers, aftermarket shocks. There's a lot of stuff on the market that's inexpensive, $300, $400, $500 at most. And hey, it's by all means better than what was on that bike from '72. Yeah. So I mean, any kind of replacement you do is certainly going to be an upgrade. But there is so much the high end stuff, from Racetech and Olin's and some of the other companies. The high end stuff is so much better in the way that it works and the ride quality it gives you. It costs twice as much, and there's a reason for that, So bear that in mind. I mean, if you go budget on that, and like I say, you get what you pay for. Yeah. You buy a $400 set of shocks. Well, sure, they're better than wear-out stockers, but they're not going to perform anywhere near the level of the set on the Racetech or Olin's or something like that.
Sure.
And folks always think about suspension is just, well, I'm not going to ride fast. I'm not a racer. I don't need good suspension. Well, okay, but what about comfort? I mean. I'm riding coast to coast on 83 Yamahas, and I'm telling you, I got Olin shocks on one bike and Racetech shocks on the other one. And, rode both those bikes with shock suspension. I'm here to tell you I couldn't do 500-600 mile days, and I couldn't do coast to coast rides on anything much less than that. So, bear that in mind. It's worth the investment.
Because once you've had
don't worry
something,
about the motor so much.
Yeah.
I mean, make sure it's reliable, make sure it runs good. But rather than throwing a bunch of money in a big bore kit and some smooth bore carbs, let's throw some money at some brakes and suspension and be comfortable and safe.
Because once you get the bike, the suspension set properly, you never want to go back. You really don't. I can see that from personal experience, especially somebody my size. There is no such thing as a stock motorcycle that's made for me. And boy, when you get it set for you and for your riding style, it's not even the same bike. But it's just the improvements are just amazing. The improvements on a vintage bike, it's kind of like a cruiser. They're so much bigger than even the improvements you see on a modern sport bike, because a modern sport bike can still see a lot of improvements by getting the suspension set to the rider. But the difference in improvement on a vintage bike or on a retro bike is so vastly bigger, because the difference it's huge. It doesn't even feel like the same motorcycle when you get on it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And Pat, you've heard me say it many times. My favorite metaphor is, hey, quarter pounder is delicious if you've never tasted filet mignon.
Yeah.
Bud Light's pretty good if you've not had Guinness.
Exactly.
It's all relative.
Absolutely.
Whatever your point of reference is, and Race Tech slogan is the best you've ridden is the best you know.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's true, because every time I do another improvement to the bike, I'm like, wow, this is great. Then we improve it again and go, wow, it wasn't as good as it, you're like, we made some big improvements on the ZRX last time, just tweaking the improvements to the suspension, and I saw a big, big improvement. But like you said, one of the things that I have noticed is with a lot of these modern suspensions when they add it to the bikes is, the fork length is different. The steering, people don't think, you have to design a certain amount of trail into the suspension. If it doesn't have trail, you're going to lose stability, which these bikes didn't have a lot of stability to begin with. And also maybe if you're putting, and here's one of the things that I see too, if you fit a retro vintage bike with modern suspension and tires, now you go from a 140 rear and a 100 front to a 120 front and a 190 rear with modern sticky rubber. You're putting a lot more force-wise through that frame.
Yeah.
So that's going to create some issues as well when you start pushing, especially when you start pushing the bike if you like to ride them harder. I just don't think those frames were designed for that level of stress.
No, they weren't. And if you're going to go that route, if that's the route that's what I want. That's what I want. And hey, you should have what you want. But, if you're going to go that route, you really need to figure into your budget, taking the frame to a qualified frame shop and having it inspected, make sure it's have them put on a jig, make sure it's straight, and have them gusset it. Gusseting a frame correctly can do wonders for it. Gusseting a frame by, best guess in the garage with a TIG welder and a 12-pack is a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, true. I've seen it too many times.
If you're going to go that route, you need to go to somebody that's got, chassis geometry measuring equipment, a CompuTrack or a Scheibner machine or something like that, so you can, test fit up these components, get some measurements, and figure out, where it's wrong, what's wrong with it, and then you can address it with triple clamp offset or fork extensions or whatever you need. But no, you're absolutely right, Pat. Those bikes had spindly frames back then, and now all of a sudden we've got radial tires and 43, 45 millimeter inverted forks and stuff like that, and it's putting inputs into that frame that it never even imagined receiving, and it creates all kinds of issues. So you got to do it right, you got to do it from the bottom, which is another reason to kind of go that middle ground, and rather than throw all that fancy stuff on there, take what you got, let's make it look good. Strip it down and polish it, powder coat it, hard anodize it. You want to make a trick, anodize some colors or something on it.
Yeah.
And do the internals up, and get it working right, and go with what you got and spend your money that way. By the time you're done, it's gonna, be half as much as trying to graft something totally different on there.
Yeah.
And the end result for the average person is probably going to be more enjoyable, than going the long way around.
Well, and I think when we talk about it, when you do customizing work, and we talk that because Steve has to do that, there's engineering behind that. It's not just making it fit. You have to make it work, and you have to have, to some level, an engineering background, and you have to understand what these changes do to the motorcycle. If I'm adding this, what am I doing to the handling of the bike? Where am I adding stress to the frame? You have to have somebody who just, because I think most customizers, and maybe you'll agree or disagree, I don't know, no matter how talented they are, a lot of them know how to weld and make things fit, but maybe don't understand how to make things work.
Why is that happening? Yeah.
Yeah.
I see a lot of that. I see a lot of that at the shop too, when people bring stuff in like with a graft front end on there, and the bike is just absolutely miserable to ride. And it normally comes down to the geometry. The bike's not set up right.
Yeah.
Normally. The bike's way too low to the ground. I had that problem with my bike. My bike was way, way, way too low to the ground. So I re-engineered the way that the suspension works and the angle the shocks sit and what kind of wheel travel that I had in there. Now the bike is 4 inches lower than stock, but it handles great. I mean, the only issue that I really get with that is when you do hard turns, you're going to drag some hard parts on the ground.
Yeah.
Most people don't ride that hard, though, that I've noticed. Or they'll freak out when that happens, and that's a recipe for disaster right there. It wasn't. If it's engineered that way and you know it's that way, I mean, you got a better heads up of what's about to happen here.
Yeah.
But if you just turn somebody loose on a bike that's not set up right, that's just a recipe to kill somebody out there, I would think.
So now here's kind of one of the final options, I think, with vintage bikes, and I think we've seen a lot more of this in the last, like you said, several years, is a modern vintage. And what I mean by that is, I ride a modern vintage, I guess you could say, a modern reproduction. We all talked about why, at the beginning of the show, why do we buy a vintage bike? It's that bike that we loved when we were a kid, or that we saw and just thought was the coolest thing. You saw, Steve McQueen riding it, whatever. And you just wanted that bike. Same reason why you want a '67 Mustang, because there's some emotional attachment to it. But now there are options for modern motorcycles that have the reliability, that can be pushed a little bit harder, that still have that vintage look. And I love using my own bike, because I say that I'll have a lot of bikes come and go in my stable, so to speak, but my ZRX will be the one that will always be there.
Well, that was probably one of the best retro reproduction bikes that I've ever seen come out. I mean, it's a heavy bike, I'll give it that, but all old bikes were heavy too, but it had modern suspension and modern tires, modern brakes on it, so it did everything well.
Yeah.
The ZRX. And I think that's probably one of the best ways to go if you're looking for that old vintage style, but you want the reliability and the handling of a late model bike.
Yeah, because even Ducati has the classic, which is, 1,000 or 1,100 cc spoke wheels. A lot of them are coming out with the retro style bikes, but that have modern components, even fuel injected now. Mine's carbureted, but they even have fuel injection versions now. And the advantage to them a lot, and fortunately with my bike, and which is nice with Racetech, is that it has a fully adjustable suspension. So I can go in and I can, my bike goes to the track all the time. Not that I'm a fast rider, but I could still put it on a track and have fun with it. So you could still get a bike that reminds you, because let's face it, if I was to find a halfway decent KZ1000R, which is what this bike was, I'm at least 10 grand into that bike.
Yeah.
And hoping that it works.
Another 10 grand to make it work.
Exactly. And let's face it, my ZRX will outperform that KZ1000R in pretty much every way. And I wouldn't want to I would be so scared to take a bike like that to the track and just destroy it. I think that is an option. Most of the manufacturers are making stuff now that has a retro feel to it, a retro look to it, that's more modern if you like that style. Like you said, if you don't, if you want to get something cheaper, there are still affordable options out there. I still think you can find, if you find that SR500, if you find that more simplistic bike, what your riding style is, because some people are going to be like Matt, and they're going to take it to New York and then across to Indiana, then down to Texas. We don't all do that. Matt rides a little bit more than most of us. But if we just need to go around town, there are those options as well. Yeah. But if you do want, and this is Matt, this is going to go towards you because you do this, what types of bikes, if somebody wants to be the crazy high miler and do the cross-country trips, what kind of vintage bikes do they need to look at, or what era or what years are they looking at to be able to pull this off?
Well, if you're going to do that, you're definitely better off with something from the 80s era, because like I say, it was about the early 80s, about 82, 81, 82, 83, where the stuff really got reliable. They had largely gone to shim and bucket type valve adjustment, which, if you take care of the bike, will hold its adjustment a long time. You got constant velocity carburetors that don't have to be tinkered with near as much, electronic ignitions, and stable charging systems and so forth. Shaft drive was much more of an option. There's nothing worse than having to lube and adjust your chain every night in the hotel and getting greasy, or God forbid you got a flat and you're out there battling with it and whatnot. So if you're gonna go cross country, shaft drive is certainly a nice option to look for. And there were a lot of bikes from that time period that had those kind of options. And the factories offered some touring style bikes that time period, and if nothing else, there was some period aftermarket and even some OEM factory touring accessories for some of those bikes. You can find them with nice big frame mounted bearings and some hard luggage and so forth, and still be retro, but not really have to worry too terribly much about dealing with the thing, as opposed to, one of my favorite stories, an interview with Peter Egan. He talked about, as Norton, left him stranded, how many times he and his wife taking a bus home and, shipping the Norton back, and, he got his first Honda 554 cylinder, and God, they rode coast to coast and back, and all they did was adjust the chain and change the oil, and it's like, yeah, something to consider. I mean, the European bikes are always sexier, but they're cantankerous. They're fiddly, and you got to mess with them. Where the Japanese bikes, they may not be quite so sexy, but there's a liability aspect there. Of they just don't leave you hanging quite as often, and you don't have to tinker with them quite as much.
Yeah, so really, if you know you're going to be putting a lot of miles on stuff, maybe the most exotic bike isn't the best choice. It's looking for something that has that reliability. And like you said, a lot of those that early 80s. I mean, even Kawasaki and Honda both, and even Yamaha made some big touring bikes back then. And there's certainly the leader bikes that were geared towards. I guess you could consider some of the first sport touring bikes. I mean, I think your ST for back then would be kind of considered a sport touring bike because it wasn't quite the KZ 1300 or whatever, 1400, whatever the 6-cylinder version. There are a lot of options out there.
Yeah, there are. Definitely. There was period stuff you could get for them, and you can take those bikes too. And if you want to make something a little bit different, a little bit sexier out of them, it could be a bit more stable platform. To put the cool hand hammer aluminum tank and bump stop seat and some drop bars and stuff on, and make yourself a cafe racer out of it. And hey, it might not be as sexy as a Triumph Bonneville, but it's go a whole lot faster and require a whole lot less work. And at the same time, it's different. That was one of the things that bummed me out with the V-twin thing was, like you said, nice bikes, nice looking bikes, works of art, but it was all the same platform. You know what I mean? It was all based on the same thing. So there was a certain sea of sameness, I guess, for lack of a better term, where you take something unique, something different you don't see all the time. Take a GS 850L, and turn it into a cafe racer, and it's pretty cool. Pretty reliable bike. It runs pretty good. And people won't even know what it is. When you put some aftermarket body work on it and change the style on it a bit, but yet have that basic reliable platform underneath there as a starting point.
And the UJMs, which were, I mean, you're starting to see modern versions of them, the Universal Japanese Motorcycles, for the people who don't know what that means. We grew up with the UJMs, but those are great platforms to do and that was pretty much the thought process behind them was let's take the bike, let's give you a starting point and do whatever the hell you want with them, because you could take the same bike and it could become a full-dress touring bike and somebody else would go and turn it into a cafe racer. So it really was not restricted to, it was probably like, here's the starting point, do what you want. And I think those are certainly great starting points for stuff. And they're really, like I said, they're reliable. Those motors in some of these bikes will last and last.
Yeah, the old CBs, the old GSs, they just keep on running. I mean, I see some of them things with a lot of miles on them, and they don't quit. They need valve adjustments. They need a valve. They need a carburetor rebuild. That's about it. But 9 times out of 10, if it has electronic ignition in it, if it's late model enough to have electronic ignition in it, normally don't have problems.
Yeah.
So fairly reliable.
Awesome.
Yeah, I pretty consistently get 100,000 miles out of my air-cooled Yamaha motors, and the only thing that's going bad on them is the valve faces and seats. The only reason those are failing is because of the gasoline they're giving us today. I can remember in the 90s, before the fuel really changed, seeing Yamaha XS11s and Suzuki GSs and Kawasaki KZs and stuff with 150, 175,000 miles on them, and the motors were fine. They may be down just a little bit on compression. They didn't smoke. They didn't use any appreciable oil. They had 150, 175,000 miles on them, but nothing but routine maintenance. So I say I get consistently right at 100,000 miles out of my Yamahas, and then the valves are whipped, and I got to put some new valves in it and do a valve job on it. But the bottom end is fine. The pistons are fine. The crank is fine. The tranny's fine.
Yeah, I think a lot of people realize that. They're probably going to think, he's getting 100,000 miles out of a vintage bike? I mean, most people wouldn't expect that out of a modern bike. Although, if you do the proper maintenance, I think that's the thing is where people fail is you can't just ride these things.
Yeah.
Well, and that's one of the pieces that's kind of interesting there, Pat, is, the modern bikes, they are now anything that's performance-oriented, let's put it that way. These things are coming from the factory at about 9/10 of potential. They've made the bearing journals as narrow as they can, and they've run the less bearing journals on the crank than they used to, and the cams are really light, and the journals are really narrow, and they got little tiny pistons in them, and that's all awesome for super high RPM and performance, but, there's going to be a limit to the longevity, even with good maintenance. Where these 70s and 80s era bikes, even though they were probably more powerful than they needed to be for, what the rest of the bike was, they were still relatively undertuned. There was still a lot of potential to be had in there.
Yeah.
So if you leave the thing stock, relatively speaking, and just, tweak up your intake and your exhaust, make it run nice with a stock motor, the motor is relatively understressed. And, with routine maintenance and oil changes, it can go a long time.
Yeah, and that's I think it's one of those things where if you take care, it's like any car, any vehicle, you take care of it, you'll get a lot more out of it. Mm-hmm. And I said, I don't ever remember when we were younger, people getting 100,000 miles out of the bikes, but it was always because people they didn't change the oil often enough, they didn't take care of them. It's amazing the difference if you just change the oil and check the bike out on a regular basis, how many more miles and how many more reliable the bike's going to be.
Mm-hmm. I see that.
Well, times have changed. I remember reading a statistic, and it was in I want to say it was the mid to late 80s, that the average lifespan of a motorcycle was 17,000 miles.
Yeah.
And it's that it was wore out. It was just that it was discarded for something new.
Yeah.
Bikes were a lot cheaper then and everything else, but, now people were tending to hold on to stuff longer and keep riding it and so forth. So now all of a sudden you're seeing stuff with high mileage on it. I remember, servicing bikes in the 80s and 90s and seeing stuff that, is 10 years old and had 10,000 miles on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, still
you ever
brand
ride
new.
this thing?
Yeah.
10,000 miles a month on my bike.
Imagine if you found a car that was 10 years old with 10,000 miles. You'd be like, holy smokes, did they ever drive this thing? But you could still find bikes like that.
Yeah.
You can. They're out there.
A couple of them triples in my shop, they're under 6,000 miles.
Wow.
But 72s, 74s, and they've been sitting for years and years and years. So they need to completely come apart. But most of that's just seals and bearings, whatever. But it's easy stuff. Now,
one big issue, and you talked about this before, was with the maintenance, is the gas is causing issues with these motors.
Yeah.
What can you do? Because it doesn't sound like they're going to take out the ethanol. It sounds like they're trying to get more in it, which is going to make it worse. Mm-hmm. What do you do to
at that point? You could rebuild your carburetors with later model O-rings and stuff like that can handle that fuel. Or you could switch to an engineered fuel, racing fuel. Well, you can get low-octane racing fuels and stuff like that, too, but that's extremely expensive to do. And where are you going to go? You're cruising across country. You're not going to stop at the Circle K and get some racing.
You got to pull it and just pick it up. Are there any additives that you can put it in the bike that will help deal with the ethanol? Or
yes and no. I'm not a huge fan on additives. Get the bike dialed into whatever fuel you're going to be running. Today's fuel. Try to get it running as best as you can on today's fuel.
Yeah.
And deal with the consequences. Normally normally ethanol burns real fast. Real fast. And them air-cooled bikes will overheat that fuel. I see a lot of that where it overheats that fuel, and then they'll get lean misfires out of them. And you could just richen that carburetor up a little bit to compensate for some of that. But as long as you get the bike dialed in, I can usually get some of these old bikes running very good. Very good on today's fuels.
Yeah, but that's also falls into finding somebody who knows what the hell they're doing.
True.
Let's face it. For any of these bikes, even a modern bike, that seems to be tougher and tougher to find. That anybody that actually doesn't want to do anything more than plug it into a computer and have the computer tell them what's wrong with it. If it goes beyond that, they're scratching their heads, going, "I don't know." Mm-hmm. People are scared of carburetors. So, Matt, what have we forgotten here? Is there anything else that we need to tell the folks out there about vintage bikes?
Well, I would say a couple of things. It goes back to a lot of things we've already discussed. But if you're going to procure a vintage bike and do something with it, you need to kind of have a little bit of a plan ahead of time. In that, okay, first off, what kind of a build am I going to do? Am I just going to restore this thing for a weekend rider enjoyment kind of a thing? Am I going to make a vintage racer? Am I going to make a cafe racer? Or what? So know what you're going to do ahead of time. And then, kind of temper and combine that with, what's your starting platform going to be? What can I afford to get? What do I have the mechanical aptitude and capability to be able to do at least a reasonable amount of work on myself? And how easy is it going to be to get parts for that particular bike?
Yeah.
Some of these bikes, it's not too bad to get parts for, but, some of these bikes, it's getting darn tough. There are some companies I've seen popping up, making replacement parts, for these bikes, rubber components and stuff you can't get. But it tends to be kind of specialized for, some of the more popular models. So, I mean, there's nothing more frustrating than finding some, interesting bike that it's all there, but, it needs parts, and then you discover you just can't find the dang parts, and then you're up against it. You have something custom fabricated, or, maybe you're having to buy a second bike for a, parts donor bike or something like that. And really, I think that's what will eventually, result in the end of the vintage craze, is that it's just going to get to the point where the bikes are bought up to the point where the prices are too high, and the parts stores are depleted to the point where you just can't get the parts you need to put something back on the road. How long that's going to take to happen, I don't know. Is it 2 years or is it 12 years? I don't know.
Yeah.
In my opinion, that's going to be the limiting factors. I mean, I've seen it where, just a few years ago, you could find all kinds of, bikes that, were largely complete and at least ran for $500-600.
Yeah.
Now that same bike is $2,600.
Yeah.
If it's in running condition. So I think that's kind of what to look at, and certainly for most folks, you're going to be money ahead to pay more for a complete running bike.
Yeah.
And then customize it to your own personal tastes. Then you are going to start out with some sort of barn find or junkyard dog that you're going to start from scratch. And work up, because you get a whole sorts of time and money on that. Spend a little bit more up front to get some more riding and enjoyment time, rather than spending 3 years building something before it's finally done.
Yeah, because unless you have the skill level of yourself or Steve, a barn find is probably a really bad idea. Unless you really know how to go through every aspect of that bike, or you just have a lot of money, which is another issue. Because you can really you could drop a lot of cash on this, and the bikes, like you said, are getting a lot more expensive. I looked at, because one of my second bike that I had, my first bike was an RD 350 that got stolen in high school, and that's a whole other story. My second bike was a KZ 650C, which was the triple disc version, and I thought, well, that would be cool to pick one of those up here, and get something to have fun with and do a little. Those things are going for $3,000-4,000 in halfway decent condition now.
Because they're impossible.
Yes, they are.
Because they're impossible to find. Almost. And when they're out there, you got to pay for it.
Oh yeah, it was the ones that were under $2,000 were junk, and you would have to put. You might as well make it a cafe project, because you're going to have to go through every aspect of the bike and redo it. But it's amazing, certain bikes, because I look back, it's a bike that I used to own. And it was a great little bike, and yeah, you'd have to do certainly you'd upgrade the suspension components and everything, but wow, the starting point. So some of these bikes have become almost too popular. You want it to be popular enough to where you can find parts for it, reliable enough to where it's not in the shop more than it is on the road, and certainly something that's going to give you some sort of enjoyment riding, because that doesn't have some of the really big downfalls. Some of these vintage bikes were a handful. The H2s are a great example. Those are tough bikes to ride.
Yeah.
Some of these bikes that you get on the gas, it's going to start doing some really silly stuff, because they had more power than the frame or the suspension can handle. Which it's kind of falls into when you get into like vintage racing. I'm sure that's another area you really have to pick and choose your battles on what bike you decide to race, which I still think would be a blast to do, because Matt, you've been around that for a long time, the vintage racing, and you see a lot of these guys that they just love doing it, and it's certainly cheaper than racing modern motorcycles, but you do have to pick your battles on those bikes.
You do, a vintage racer can typically run the whole season on one set of tires, two at the most. You're going to go out there and, even at an amateur level, wear a race, well, you're going to go through a couple sets of tires on a weekend.
Yeah, at least, yeah.
But at the same time, it always escalates like everything else does, and so a couple of the more popular classes, in Armor Road Racing, for instance, are, and there's a lot of, offshoots of that regional divisions and so forth that run, similar rules and similar classes. But, 350 Hondas are very popular, because it's you can run surprisingly well, and it's a decent starting platform, easy to build and so forth, and reliable. But they're starting to get scarce. They started racing CB 160s here a few years ago, and that's a really big thing. And when it first started out, it was supposed to be like the introductory class, the inexpensive way to get into it, And I've watched over the last 5 years as these people have escalated this, and the money some of these people have in these bikes is just mind-boggling, and this kind of, and that's the way it is with racing. You start out with some sort of, theoretically box stock class or limited modification class, and, people keep upping the ante, and the rules keep getting changed, and all of a sudden, a few years later, now it's actually kind of a high-dollar class. But on the other hand, when the top speed is 72 miles an hour, if you come off the thing at speed, chances are you still make it to work on Monday.
Yeah.
So,
Exactly. Exactly. Well, guys, I really appreciate you spending the time with me. I think this has been a great conversation, and it's something that we're certainly going to have more fun with on Cycle Sports TV, because we have a few vintage projects we're going to do this year. Matt, if you could just let everybody know if somebody needs to get a hold of you, and obviously you are the suspension guru, the race tech guy. How do they get a hold and find Matt Wiley?
Well, a couple different avenues. My email is listed on the Racetech website on both the vintage street and pavement and the vintage off-road pages. There's a hot link there to me. Get on there and shoot me an email. Also through my personal website, moto-services.net. It's another way to get a hold of me if you're looking for stuff outside of the Racetech venue. I love vintage riders and vintage bikes. It's what I'm into, and welcome anybody that needs some assistance. Get a hold of me, and we'll go from there.
Awesome. And Steve?
Yes, I can be reached through my website, Las Vegas Dyno Tech. Emails are on there. We have a Facebook set up too, LV Dyno Tech. You can look on there. Look at all the specials we're doing, all the weird bikes we're working on. And if you get any questions, you just give the shop a call. And
awesome. And I forgot to mention this before we wrap this up. The last thing we're going to talk about, because it's a cool thing that you and Tara do, is you put together vintage bike nights once a month here in Vegas, which is an awesome event. If you want to see some really cool bikes, you got to come down and do it. Talk to you a little bit about what you guys do with the vintage bike night.
Vintage bike night we started vintage bike night about a year and a half ago. We do it every third Friday downtown Las Vegas, and it started off as a birthday party for me from
I remember that.
My beautiful Tara. She threw me a bike night, a vintage bike night, and that was by her choice. She wanted to do a vintage bike night. You don't see any vintage bike nights in the city of Las Vegas. I've been here for 20 years, and I've been to hundreds of bike nights, and nothing to this caliber have I seen. We get in 200, 300, 400 bikes at a time sometimes, and you've been down there a few times, Pat.
Oh yeah,
we got a whole section set up just for vintage bikes, and everything from old Harleys to old Japanese bikes, old European bikes, all the way down to scooters and Vespas. Vespas, that's a huge cult following on Vespas nowadays. We're doing a whole bunch of work on them things at the shop too, and we have a whole section set up down there for the Vespas that come in. But it's a good time. We have good food, good music, and good people to hang around. And it's like the no drama zone there. Everybody's there just to see the old bikes or the new bikes or whatever.
Yeah, and it's a great place too. We talked about if you want to get into this, if you actually want to decide to do it, there's the place to go, because let's face it, there's a bunch of people with the same passion. If you want to get now, let's face it, you don't always get good information. It depends on where you get it, but if you're more likely to find that right person at an event where you have all these people that share that same passion. I think that's the important part, is they have to share a passion. You're not just going to find some guy that just kind of works on vintage bikes.
I would say most of the guys that bring their vintage bikes there know them bikes really well.
Yeah.
They work on them, most of them. I'll do some dyno tuning stuff on them, get carburetors set up right.
Yeah.
But for the majority of it, most of these guys work on their own bikes. And they build that bike to what they want. And some of them are, some of them are okay. Some of them are very beautiful. Some of them are showroom, factory condition, old 60s bikes and stuff like that. It just blows your mind when you see them. You see a Ariel Square 4 in showroom condition. That was one of the very first bikes I've ever seen, and showed up at Vintage Bike Night. It's been in some guy's garage here in Vegas for years. So that's just good stuff that we catch downtown, and we do that every third Friday of the month.
Yeah, and if you're in Vegas, on the third Friday, you definitely got to check it out. It's a cool, even if you don't have a vintage bike, just to go and just check everything out. It's a great atmosphere, and every week there's different bikes there, and there's different cool stuff. And for the people who have been on the fence as to whether or not vintage bikes, go hang out with some of these guys. Go check it out. It's truly an area where you see some passionate people.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little bit different culture than the modern bike thing.
Exactly.
You know, definitely a little bit more laid back, definitely a little bit more passionate rider and so forth.
Absolutely, and it's a whole lot of fun. And I said, if you like working on your own bike, if you like being able to actually do a little wrenching yourself and actually be able to get to something. I mean, let's face it, you take the tank or the tank cover on some bikes off of a modern bike and look underneath it, you go, yeah, I think I'll take that to the shop, because
That's what I say when the CBRs come in.
yeah, because some of them you're just like, holy smokes. I mean,
do a valve adjustment on a late model CBR.
Never been able to confirm this, but the rumor is, and a couple of people I know at Honda have said they think it's probably true, but the rumor is a Honda GL 1800 Goldwing has more part numbers than a Honda Civic car.
True. I've heard that, Matt. I want to agree on that because I had an old Goldwing apart last week and doing an ignition switch in there, and I couldn't believe the bucket of screws that I had. The size of the bucket of screws that I had just to get the ignition switch out of this thing. But, yeah,
I can believe it.
I 100% agree with you on that one, Matt.
Yep, crazy stuff.
Honda has great build quality, but some of their touring stuff, man, it's parts intensive. Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for being on the show today. It has been absolutely awesome talking vintage bikes with you. We have Steve McAnulty from Las Vegas Dyno Tech from right here in town. On the phone from Arizona, Matt Wiley of Racetech Suspension. You guys have been absolutely amazing today. And, of course, my name is Pat Harris. I am your host, and I'm also the executive producer of Cycle Sports TV. And if you want to check out any one of our 100 videos on the web, head on over to YouTube and just look up Cycle Sports TV. And if you're a social media addict like any of the rest of us, just check us out on Facebook or Twitter at Cycle Sports TV. Hit us up if you have any questions, any subjects that you would like covered. We're here for you. We have some amazingly talented people, resources to pull from. So make sure to keep in touch. Let us know what you want to hear on the next episode of Cycle Sports Radio.